The apartment door slammed with a finality that echoed through the hallway, but Jessica Morgan didn't care as she stood in the threshold, her manicured finger pointing at the battered suitcase beside her husband's feet. Daniel Morgan, dressed in his usual thrift store jacket and scuffed shoes, stared at the woman he'd loved for 6 years, but the contempt in her eyes told him everything he needed to know about their marriage. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't the poor delivery driver who could barely make rent. It was Trevor Blackwood, her ex-boyfriend who'd just returned to the city with his luxury car and designer suits. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she threw Daniel's belongings into the hallway, was that 24 hours earlier, a team of lawyers had tracked him down at his delivery route to inform him that his estranged uncle had died. But the inheritance wasn't just money. It was the Crown Point Tower, the most expensive $100 million skyscraper dominating the city's financial district. Daniel had planned to tell her that evening, but as Trevor's Mercedes pulled up to the curb and Jessica ran down to embrace her former flame, Daniel picked up his suitcase and walked away with a secret that would change everything. The wedding invitations had already been sent, the venue booked at the city's most prestigious hotel, but Jessica had no idea that the homeless-looking man she'd just discarded owned the very building where Trevor's company rented their offices, or that the revenge Daniel would orchestrate wouldn't just ruin her wedding. It would leave Trevor Blackwood completely destitute and begging on the streets where Daniel once struggled. How could a woman who prided herself on reading people get it so catastrophically wrong? What would she do when she discovered the truth? And could Trevor's empire survive what was coming? The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour laundromat hummed overhead, but Daniel Morgan sat motionless on the plastic chair, staring at the business card in his trembling hands. The card read, Harrison and Associates Estate Attorneys, but the weight of what it represented pressed down on his chest like a physical force. 48 hours had passed since Jessica kicked him out, but the memory still burned with the intensity of a fresh wound. He'd been delivering packages in the rain when the black sedan pulled up beside him, but instead of another angry customer complaining about a late delivery, 2 lawyers in expensive suits had stepped out with documents that would change his life. His uncle Richard Morgan, a man Daniel had met only twice in his childhood before a family feud severed all contact, had died 3 weeks earlier, but the estate had taken time to locate Daniel through layers of estrangement and name changes. The skyscraper was real. Crown Point Tower, 58 stories of gleaming glass and steel, but more than just a building. It was a monument to commercial success, housing 36 companies including law firms, tech startups, and investment banks. The property value alone exceeded $100 million, but the annual rental income generated another $12 million, a figure that made Daniel's $700 weekly delivery salary seem like pocket change. But the irony twisted deeper than Jessica could imagine. Trevor Blackwood's company, Blackwood Consulting LLC, rented the entire 42nd floor, but their lease was up for renewal in 30 days, a detail the previous building manager had mentioned casually during Daniel's orientation meeting with Harrison and Associates. The lawyers had explained everything: the property management company, the existing leases, the maintenance contracts, but most importantly, his absolute authority as the sole owner to make any decisions regarding tenants. Daniel's phone buzzed with another message from Jessica, but this one carried a different tone than her previous demands for him to return her spare key. Daniel, I know this is difficult, but Trevor and I are getting married in 3 weeks. I hope you can be happy for me. I've moved on, and you should too. Also, Trevor mentioned he might have a better job opportunity for you at his company. He feels bad about how things worked out. The audacity would have been laughable, but Daniel felt only the cold calculation of someone who'd been pushed too far. Trevor Blackwood felt bad. The same Trevor who'd spent their entire relationship before Daniel controlling Jessica's finances, isolating her from friends, and leaving her with $20,000 in credit card debt when he'd abruptly moved to Seattle for a better opportunity. The same Trevor who'd returned to the city 6 months ago, seen Jessica had rebuilt her life, and decided to reclaim her like a discarded toy he suddenly wanted again. But Jessica had changed in Trevor's absence. The woman Daniel married had been kind, ambitious, and resilient. But somewhere along the way, perhaps in the last year as Daniel's delivery job became more demanding and the bills piled higher, she'd grown resentful. The studio apartment they shared in the city's marginal neighborhood wasn't the life she'd envisioned. But Daniel had been working on something bigger, saving every spare dollar for the business loan application that would let him start his own logistics company. He'd never gotten the chance to submit that application, but now he didn't need it. The laundromat door chimed as an elderly woman entered with her basket, but Daniel barely noticed as he dialed the number for Harrison and Associates. Margaret Harrison, the senior partner, answered on the second ring with the crisp efficiency of someone who billed by the 6-minute increment. "Mr. Morgan, I hope you've had time to review the documents we provided." "I have, but I need to understand something about the Blackwood Consulting lease," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "What are my options?" Margaret's pause suggested she understood exactly what he was asking, but her response remained professionally neutral. "As the property owner, you have the right to approve or deny any lease renewal. However, I should note that Blackwood Consulting has been a reliable tenant for 4 years, but their contract includes a standard clause allowing for termination with 60 days notice from either party. Since they're already within that window, you could choose not to renew. And if I don't renew, but I offer them month-to-month at market rate instead of their current below-market rate, market rate for that floor would be approximately $48,000 per month, but their current lease has them at $32,000 due to a favorable agreement signed during a period when the building had higher vacancy rates. If you offered month-to-month at market rate, they could either accept, negotiate, or vacate." Daniel closed his eyes, but the image of Jessica in Trevor's arms wouldn't fade. She'd called Daniel a failure, a disappointment, a man with no ambition, but all while wearing the diamond bracelet Trevor had bought her, with money earned from a company operating in a building Daniel now owned. "What else can you tell me about Blackwood Consulting's financial situation?" Daniel asked. "I'm not privy to their internal finances, but public records show they've expanded significantly in the past year, taking on considerable debt to hire new staff and lease additional office space in 2 other buildings. They also invested heavily in a marketing campaign. The commercial real estate market has been challenging lately, but companies in their sector have been struggling with client retention." The pieces were falling into place, but Daniel needed more information. He spent the next 3 hours in the laundromat, using the public Wi-Fi to research Trevor Blackwood's company with an intensity that surprised him. What he discovered painted a picture of aggressive expansion funded by risky borrowing, but impressive revenue growth that had attracted attention from industry publications. Trevor had positioned himself as a visionary, but the foundation looked increasingly unstable. Multiple business forums discussed concerns about Blackwood Consulting's client acquisition costs, but Trevor kept projecting confidence in interviews, always photographed in expensive suits against the backdrop of Crown Point Tower's impressive logo. Daniel's next call was to Marcus Chen, not the generic name he'd been told to avoid, but a college friend who worked as a commercial real estate broker and understood the city's business ecosystem better than anyone Daniel knew. "Danny, man, I heard about you and Jessica. I'm really sorry," Marcus said, his voice carrying genuine sympathy. Are you doing okay? I'm figuring things out, but I need your expertise. What do you know about Blackwood Consulting? Marcus whistled low. Trevor Blackwood's outfit? Everyone in commercial real estate knows about them. They're the hot company right now, but there's a lot of whispers about their fundamentals. Why? Daniel hesitated, but decided trust was necessary. I'm about to become their landlord, and I need to know if they can actually afford their rent. The silence stretched for several seconds before Marcus spoke again, his tone sharp with confusion. What are you talking about? Their landlord is some estate that owns Crown Point Tower, unless... The pause grew heavier. Danny, what's going on? Over the next 30 minutes, Daniel explained everything, but Marcus's reactions shifted from disbelief to amazement to something resembling concern. This is incredible, but also potentially complicated, Marcus said carefully. If you're thinking about making Trevor's life difficult, you need to be strategic. Going after him directly could backfire legally and personally. However, if you're simply making sound business decisions as a property owner, that's different. I'm listening. Blackwood Consulting is leveraged heavily. They're paying below market rent at Crown Point, which has been crucial to their profit margins. If that cost suddenly increases by 50%, they'll have to cut somewhere else, probably staff or marketing. But here's the thing. 3 of their biggest clients are also tenants in Crown Point Tower. If those relationships sour because Trevor can't maintain his professional image, Daniel felt a cold smile forming. The whole house of cards collapses. Exactly, but you can't be obvious about it. You need to approach this like a legitimate businessman making legitimate decisions. Increase the rent to market rate. That's defensible. If Trevor can't afford it, that's his problem. The fallout will happen naturally. But Daniel wanted more than just financial pressure. He wanted Trevor to feel the same helplessness, the same humiliation that Jessica had inflicted when she'd thrown his clothes into the hallway while the neighbors watched. He wanted the wedding ruined not through sabotage, but through the unavoidable consequences of Trevor's own poor decisions. There's something else, Daniel said slowly. Jessica's marrying him in 3 weeks at the Continental Hotel. They're spending a fortune on this wedding. I saw the budget once and it was over $80,000. But if Trevor's company suddenly faces a financial crisis right before the wedding... Marcus's laugh was sharp and understanding. The wedding becomes the final nail in the coffin. Listen, I can help you with the business side, but you need to be prepared for the personal fallout. Jessica's going to find out who you are eventually. When she does, this gets messy. It's already messy, but at least this way I control the narrative. The next morning, Daniel met with Margaret Harrison at the law firm's downtown office, but the building's marble lobby and mahogany-paneled conference rooms felt surreal after years of struggling to pay rent on a studio apartment. Margaret had assembled a team of 3 associates, but their presentation covered everything from property management to tax implications to strategic planning for Crown Point Tower. The building is performing well financially, but there's room for optimization, Margaret explained, sliding a bound report across the conference table. Several leases are below current market rates due to agreements signed years ago. As these come up for renewal, you have the opportunity to adjust pricing to reflect actual value. Daniel studied the spreadsheet, but one line item drew his attention immediately. Blackwood Consulting LLC, floor 42, current monthly rent, $32,000, market rate $48,000, lease expiration 28 days. I want to send Blackwood Consulting a lease renewal offer at market rate, but make it month to month rather than the multi-year agreement they probably expect, Daniel said, and I want it delivered tomorrow. Margaret's expression remained neutral, but her eyes flickered with something that might have been approval or concern. That's within your rights as the property owner, but such a significant increase with reduced lease security might be seen as aggressive. Are you prepared for potential pushback? I am, but I want everything documented properly so there's no legal vulnerability. Understood. We'll draft the proposal today. Daniel left the law office feeling like a stranger to himself, but the transformation had only begun. His next stop was a men's clothing store in the financial district, but not one of the affordable chains where he'd bought his delivery uniform. Instead, he walked into the same boutique where Trevor had once bragged about buying his suits, a detail Jessica had mentioned during happier times. The salesman, a distinguished man in his 50s named Robert, approached with practiced courtesy, but his expression flickered briefly when he assessed Daniel's current appearance. Faded jeans, worn jacket, shoes with soles that were separating. To his credit, Robert's professionalism never wavered. "Good morning, sir. How can I assist you today?" "I need a complete wardrobe overhaul," Daniel said quietly. "Business suits, casual wear, accessories, everything. Budget isn't a concern, but I need to look like I belong in a boardroom." Robert's eyebrows rose fractionally, but he nodded. "Excellent. Let's start with measurements and discuss your specific needs." 2 hours later, Daniel left the store with 4 tailored suits being adjusted for rush delivery, but he wore one off-the-rack option that Robert had modified quickly, a charcoal gray ensemble that transformed his appearance completely. The shop's mirror reflected someone Daniel barely recognized, confident, polished, successful. The contrast with the man Jessica had kicked out felt like a statement. But the physical transformation was only part of the strategy. Daniel's next call was to a private investigator recommended by Marcus, but the conversation was brief and focused. He needed information about Trevor's financial situation, his business practices, and most importantly, any vulnerabilities that might exist in Blackwood Consulting's operations. "I can get you what you need in a week," the investigator, a former FBI agent named Patricia Reeves, said matter-of-factly. "But I need to know what you're planning to do with this information. I don't participate in anything illegal or unethical." "I'm a property owner conducting due diligence on a tenant," Daniel replied. "Everything I'm doing is legal, but I want to make informed decisions about lease agreements." "Fair enough. I'll be in touch." The weekend passed in a blur of activity as Daniel moved from the laundromat to a furnished apartment he'd rented in a building not far from Crown Point Tower. Nothing extravagant yet, but comfortable and professional. He spent hours reviewing the building's financial records, learning the names of major tenants, understanding the property management company's operations, but always circling back to one question: how could he maximize the impact when Trevor received the lease renewal notice? The answer came Monday morning when Margaret Harrison called with an update. The lease renewal offer was hand-delivered to Trevor Blackwood's office at 9 a.m. today, she reported. "Our courier waited to ensure he received it personally. Based on the reception we've heard through the property manager, Mr. Blackwood was quite surprised by the terms." "Surprised is a mild word for what I'm hoping he felt," Daniel said. "What happens next?" "He'll likely want to negotiate. The standard process would be for him to contact either you directly or through us to discuss terms. However, I should warn you that he might also seek legal counsel to challenge the increase." "Can he challenge it legally?" "Not successfully. The lease clearly states the terms expire in 28 days. And as the property owner, you're entitled to set market rate pricing. His previous rate was a courtesy from the prior owner, not a legal guarantee." Daniel smiled grimly. "Then we wait for his response." But Trevor's response came faster and more directly than expected. That afternoon, Daniel's phone rang with an unknown number, and when he answered, Trevor Blackwood's voice carried the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Daniel Morgan, This is Trevor Blackwood. I think we should talk." The presumption that Daniel would immediately recognize the name, combined with the lack of any acknowledgement of their shared connection through Jessica, made Daniel's jaw tighten, but he kept his voice neutral. "Mr. Blackwood, what can I do for you? I received a rather shocking lease renewal offer today from Crown Point Towers Management Company. They claim the building has new ownership, and you're the owner. Given my relationship with your ex-wife, well, your soon-to-be ex-wife, I thought we should discuss this situation man to man." The casual cruelty of the phrasing wasn't lost on Daniel, but he let the silence stretch uncomfortably before responding. "The lease offer reflects current market rates for premium office space in the financial district. If you review comparable properties, you'll find the pricing is competitive." "Come on, Daniel, let's be realistic here. You're clearly upset about Jessica and me, and I understand that. But taking it out on my business isn't the answer. Jessica told me about your financial struggles, and I actually wanted to help you out with a job offer. But this lease situation, it's vindictive, and it's beneath you." The condescension was breathtaking, but Daniel forced himself to remain calm. "My decisions regarding Crown Point Tower are purely business-related. Your company has been paying below-market rent for years. That arrangement ended when the property changed hands. If you can't afford the new rate, there are other buildings in the city." Trevor's tone hardened slightly. "Below market? Your uncle gave us that rate because we brought prestige to the building. Blackwood Consulting is one of the most respected firms in the city, and having us as a tenant increases the property's value. If you force us out, you'll regret it." "Is that a threat, Mr. Blackwood?" "It's reality. I have connections in this city's business community, and if word gets out that Crown Point Tower's new owner is difficult to work with, you'll find it hard to attract quality tenants. Let's meet in person and work this out like professionals. I'm sure we can find a solution that benefits everyone." Daniel considered the proposition, but every instinct warned him that Trevor would use an in-person meeting to manipulate, intimidate, or somehow gain the upper hand. Instead, he made a calculated decision that would set the tone for everything that followed. "I don't think a meeting is necessary, but I'll make you a counteroffer. You can continue at your current rate for 1 additional month while you search for alternative office space. That gives you time to relocate without disruption. After that, if you choose to stay, the new market rate applies with a month-to-month agreement. No long-term lease." The silence on Trevor's end was profound, but when he spoke, again the smoothness had vanished entirely, replaced by barely controlled anger. "You're making a serious mistake. Jessica will hear about this, and when she realizes you're sabotaging her future husband's business out of petty jealousy, she'll despise you even more than she already does. You're pathetic, Daniel. You always have been." The line went dead, but Daniel felt nothing except cold satisfaction. Trevor had revealed his true nature in less than 5 minutes, confirming everything Daniel had suspected about the man's character. More importantly, Trevor would now be operating from a position of fear and anger, which meant he'd make mistakes. But Daniel's calculation proved more accurate than he'd imagined. Within hours, Jessica called, and her voice vibrated with fury in a way Daniel had never heard during their marriage. "What the hell are you doing, Daniel? Trevor told me you inherited some building, and now you're trying to destroy his company because you can't handle us being together. This is so typical of you. You've always been selfish and small-minded, but I never thought you'd stoop this low." Daniel let her vent for nearly a minute before interrupting calmly. "Jessica, I own a commercial property, and I'm adjusting lease rates to market standards. This has nothing to do with you or your relationship with Trevor. It's business." "Business? You're charging him 60% more than he's been paying. That's not business, that's revenge. Trevor's company is successful because he's smart and hardworking, everything you never were. He's built something real while you were delivering packages and complaining about how unfair life was. And now you luck into some inheritance, and the first thing you do is attack him? You're disgusting." The words stung more than Daniel wanted to admit, but they also crystallized something important. Jessica had fully bought into Trevor's version of reality, where the rent increase was persecution rather than standard business practice. She'd chosen her side completely, which meant Daniel's plans could proceed without guilt or hesitation. "I'm sorry you see it that way," Daniel said quietly, "but my decision stands. Trevor can accept the new terms, find alternative office space, or negotiate a transition period. Those are his options. You know what? I'm glad I left you. I'm glad I found someone who actually has ambition and success. Trevor's going to be my husband in 3 weeks, and we're going to have an amazing life together while you sit alone in whatever pathetic apartment you're renting, bitter and angry because you threw away the best thing that ever happened to you. Don't contact me again." She hung up without waiting for a response, but Daniel sat in his new apartment, staring at the phone and feeling the full weight of what he was about to do. A part of him, a small, fading part, wanted to call her back, explain everything, show her that he wasn't the failure she believed him to be, but that part was overshadowed by the memory of her contempt, Trevor's smugness, and the realization that some bridges needed to burn completely before anything new could be built. The private investigator's report arrived 5 days later, but its contents exceeded Daniel's expectations. Patricia Reeves had been thorough, documenting not just Trevor's business practices, but the intricate web of financial arrangements that kept Blackwood Consulting afloat. The summary painted a damning picture. Trevor had expanded aggressively using a combination of business loans, personal credit, and investor funding, but the company's actual profitability was razor-thin once accounting for all obligations. The impressive revenue figures were real, but so were the massive expenses for staff, marketing, and the lifestyle Trevor maintained to project success. Most critically, 3 major clients, who collectively represented 40% of Blackwood Consulting's revenue, had recently expressed concerns about renewing their contracts due to service quality issues and Trevor's increasingly erratic behavior. But the bombshell came in the report's appendix. Trevor had personally guaranteed several of the business loans, meaning that if Blackwood Consulting failed, his personal assets would be vulnerable. Additionally, he'd been borrowing against future contracts that weren't yet finalized, a risky practice that could unravel quickly if clients walked away. The wedding expenses added another layer of precariousness. Trevor had spent nearly $90,000 on the Continental Hotel event, but the investigator's sources indicated he'd financed much of it through personal credit cards, expecting bonuses from several client deals that were now in jeopardy. Daniel read the report 3 times, but each review only reinforced his understanding. Trevor Blackwood was a house of cards waiting for a strong wind. The rent increase wasn't the wind itself. It was merely the first gust in what could become a devastating storm. His next move required precision timing. Daniel contacted the 3 clients Patricia had identified as wavering in their commitment to Blackwood Consulting, but he didn't approach them as a rival or saboteur. Instead, he reached out as the owner of Crown Point Tower, offering to meet and discuss their office space needs and satisfaction with the building's amenities. The meetings were illuminating. Each client expressed appreciation for the building's location and facilities, but when Daniel gently inquired about their relationship with other tenants like Blackwood Consulting, the complaints emerged naturally. Trevor had overpromised on deliverables, missed deadlines, and become defensive when confronted with performance issues. His staff turnover was high, suggesting internal problems that affected service quality. Daniel never explicitly encouraged these companies to leave Blackwood Consulting, but he did mention that Crown Point Tower housed several other consulting firms with excellent reputations, and he'd be happy to facilitate introductions if they were ever seeking alternatives. The seed was planted with such subtlety that none of the clients realized they'd been influenced. Meanwhile, Trevor's response to the lease situation grew increasingly desperate. He'd hired a lawyer to review the terms, but as Margaret Harrison had predicted, there was no legal basis to challenge the increase. The lawyer's letter was professionally written but ultimately toothless, requesting reasonable accommodation and good faith negotiation without offering any legal arguments. Daniel's counter-response, drafted by Harrison and Associates, was cordial but firm. The market rate offer stood, but Trevor had 2 weeks to decide whether to accept month-to-month terms, negotiate a higher monthly rate for a 1-year lease, or vacate the space. No other options were available. The pressure was mounting exactly as Daniel had calculated, but the wedding date loomed just 10 days away. Trevor was now facing multiple crises simultaneously: the rent increase, wavering client relationships, cash flow problems, and the massive financial commitment of his wedding to Jessica. Any one of these issues would be manageable, but combined, they created a perfect storm of stress. But Daniel's strategy had one more element that would prove decisive. Through Marcus's connections in the commercial real estate community, Daniel quietly let it be known that Crown Point Tower was under new ownership and that the new owner was conducting a comprehensive review of all tenant relationships, with a focus on companies that aligned with the building's elevated standards. The phrasing was vague but effective, creating uncertainty among tenants about their lease security. For most companies, this merely meant maintaining professional operations and paying rent on time. No real concern. But for Trevor, who'd built his reputation partly on his prominent Crown Point address, the suggestion that his tenancy might not be renewed created additional anxiety. The gossip spread through the building's business community within days. By the end of the week, Daniel began receiving calls from other tenants requesting meetings to ensure their lease status was secure. Each meeting was an opportunity for Daniel to present himself as a reasonable professional property owner interested in long-term relationships with quality tenants. But the contrast with Trevor's increasingly frantic behavior became more apparent. Daniel heard through the property manager that Trevor had been seen arguing loudly on his phone in the building's lobby, that Blackwood consulting staff were working late hours more frequently, and that several employees had been let go abruptly, likely a cost-cutting measure in response to the impending rent increase. 7 days before the wedding, one of Trevor's major clients officially terminated their contract. The company's CEO, whom Daniel had met during his tenant outreach, sent a professional email citing concerns about service delivery and communication. But the timing was devastating for Trevor. That client had represented 15% of Blackwood Consulting's revenue, and losing them meant Trevor's already tight margins evaporated entirely. Daniel learned about the termination through Marcus, who'd heard it through industry channels, but he also noticed something else. The city's business community was starting to talk about Blackwood Consulting's struggles. In the interconnected world of professional services, reputation was everything, and whispers about financial problems could become self-fulfilling prophecies as other clients grew nervous. But Jessica remained either unaware or in denial about the emerging crisis. Her social media posts showed her excitedly preparing for the wedding, sharing photos of her dress fittings and floral arrangements, tagging Trevor in romantic captions about their future together. The contrast between her public joy and Trevor's private crisis was almost surreal. Daniel wrestled with conflicting emotions during this period. Part of him felt satisfaction at seeing his plan work so effectively, but another part, a part he tried to suppress, felt something like guilt. Jessica was about to marry a man whose entire life was collapsing, and she had no idea. When she discovered the truth, the shock would be devastating. Did she deserve that? The question haunted Daniel late at night in his apartment, but every time doubt crept in, he remembered her words. "You're pathetic. You always have been." He remembered the neighbors watching as she threw his clothes into the hallway. He remembered Trevor's condescending offer to help him out with a job. He remembered 6 years of marriage discarded without hesitation the moment someone wealthier appeared. The guilt faded, but the determination remained. 4 days before the wedding, Trevor made his final attempt to salvage the lease situation. He called Daniel directly, bypassing the lawyers, and his voice carried none of the previous smugness. Only desperation. "Daniel, please, I need you to reconsider this lease situation. My company is going through a rough patch, and the timing couldn't be worse. If you give me 6 months at the current rate, I can stabilize things, and then we can talk about a reasonable increase. I'm asking you as someone who's about to marry Jessica. As family." The word family was particularly galling, but Daniel kept his response measured. "Trevor, I've made my position clear. The offer stands as presented. You have 4 days before your current lease expires to accept the new terms or vacate. You're destroying my business over a personal grudge. Do you understand what you're doing? If Blackwood Consulting fails, it doesn't just affect me. It affects my employees, their families, everyone who depends on this company. Jessica will be affected too. Is that what you want?" "What I want is for my property to generate appropriate market returns," Daniel replied. "Your business challenges aren't my responsibility. You've had weeks to find alternative arrangements or adjust your operations. The fact that you haven't isn't my fault." "This is insane. You've clearly never run a business if you think these demands are reasonable. You inherited a building through dumb luck, and now you're pretending to be some kind of real estate mogul. You're still the same broke delivery driver Jessica left. You're just temporarily playing dress-up with someone else's money." Daniel smiled coldly at that assessment. "If that's how you see it, Trevor, then you should have no problem finding a new office space. After all, a successful businessman like yourself must have plenty of options. Good luck with the wedding." He ended the call, but Trevor's words revealed the full extent of his panic. The wedding was in 4 days, the lease expired in 4 days, and Trevor's entire professional and personal life was converging toward a crisis point he couldn't avoid. The next 2 days brought a cascade of developments that exceeded even Daniel's planning. Another of Trevor's major clients announced they were reviewing their consulting relationships, which was corporate speak for exploring alternatives. Blackwood Consulting's staff began updating their LinkedIn profiles and reaching out to recruiters, suggesting they sensed the company's instability. And Trevor's behavior, according to reports from Crown Point Tower's property manager, became increasingly erratic. Aggressive conversations with staff, missed meetings, visible stress, but the wedding preparations continued as if nothing was wrong. Jessica's social media showed her at a spa day with bridesmaids, laughing and celebrating, completely unaware that in less than 72 hours, her entire life would implode. Daniel found himself thinking about her more during these final days, not with longing or regret, but with something approaching clinical curiosity. How would she react when the truth emerged? Would she blame Trevor for hiding his problems? Would she blame Daniel for causing them? Would she recognize her own role in creating this situation by choosing wealth over character? The wedding day arrived with unexpected sunshine, but Daniel spent the morning in his apartment reviewing final details with Margaret Harrison. Blackwood Consulting's lease had expired at midnight, and Trevor had until 5 p.m. to either accept the new terms or vacate the premises. He'd done neither, which meant he was now technically in violation of the lease agreement and subject to holdover fees. "We could begin eviction proceedings immediately," Margaret noted. but given that today is his wedding day, it might be seen as excessively aggressive. No eviction yet, Daniel decided, but I want him to know that as of today, he's operating without a valid lease and accruing additional fees. Send the notice to his office and his personal email. Understood. There's one other matter you should be aware of. The Continental Hotel where the wedding is being held called our office this morning. Apparently there's been an issue with Mr. Blackwood's payment for the venue. His credit card was declined for the final installment, and they're threatening to cancel the event unless payment is received by 2 p.m. Daniel felt a jolt of surprise, though perhaps he shouldn't have been surprised. Trevor's financial situation had deteriorated even faster than projected. How much is the outstanding balance? $42,000. Daniel checked his watch, 11:30 a.m. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 5 p.m., with the reception following at 6:30 p.m. Trevor had less than 3 hours to solve a $42,000 problem, while also dealing with his business crisis and the knowledge that his office lease had expired. But what Daniel did next surprised even himself. He asked Margaret to contact the Continental Hotel and offer to settle Trevor's debt, not as a gift, but as a loan that would be documented and legally enforceable. The hotel would get their money, the wedding would proceed, but Trevor would owe Daniel directly, creating yet another pressure point. "Are you certain about this?" Margaret asked. "It seems almost cruel." "It's business," Daniel replied, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed that anymore. "And it ensures the wedding happens, which is important." What he didn't say, what he barely wanted to acknowledge to himself, was that he needed Jessica to go through with the wedding. He needed her to stand at the altar and commit herself to Trevor publicly, in front of all their friends and family, before the full scope of Trevor's failure became undeniable. The humiliation needed to be complete. The Continental Hotel accepted the arrangement, and at 1:45 p.m., Margaret called to confirm that Trevor had been informed of the loan. His reaction, according to the hotel manager, had been stunned silence followed by a desperate question. Why would Daniel Morgan do this? Daniel had no answer for that question, except perhaps that revenge was more satisfying when it was thorough. The afternoon crawled by with excruciating slowness. Daniel knew he couldn't attend the wedding. His presence would be too inflammatory, too obvious. But Marcus had agreed to go as a guest of one of Jessica's friends from college, providing Daniel with real-time updates on the proceedings. At 4:30 p.m., Marcus texted, "Guests arriving. Jessica looks beautiful. Trevor looks sick. Literally, he's pale and sweating. Something's wrong." At 5:15 p.m., ceremony started late. Trevor almost passed out during vows. Jessica didn't notice. She's beaming. This is uncomfortable to watch. At 5:47 p.m., they're married. Trevor looked like he was going to vomit when they kissed. Now heading to cocktail hour. At 6:30 p.m., reception starting. Trevor disappeared for 20 minutes. Bathroom, maybe? Jessica's getting concerned. Guests are whispering. At 7:15 p.m., something's happening. Trevor's on his phone, looks panicked. Jessica's trying to get him to dance. He's ignoring her. This is bad. At 7:42 p.m., Trevor just left the ballroom. Jessica followed him. People are staring. Hold on. The gap in messages lasted nearly 30 minutes, but when Marcus finally texted again, his message was simple. "You need to see this." A moment later, a video arrived. The footage was shaky, clearly shot discreetly from across the room, but the audio was clear enough. Trevor and Jessica stood near the hotel's terrace doors, partially visible to the reception guests, and their voices carried despite obvious attempts to keep the conversation private. "What do you mean the company's failing?" Jessica's voice was sharp with confusion and rising panic. "You said everything was fine. You said the business was thriving." It was fine until your ex-husband decided to destroy me." Trevor's response was nearly a shout, his composure completely shattered. He inherited that building just to fuck with us. The rent increase, the timing, everything. He planned this. "Daniel owns Crown Point Tower?" Jessica's tone shifted from panic to disbelief. "That's not possible. He was a delivery driver. He didn't have any money." "Well, he has money now, and he's using it to ruin everything. I've lost clients. I can't make payroll. The lease is expired, and I had to borrow $42,000 from him just to pay for this goddamn wedding. We're drowning, Jessica, and it's all because of him." The video showed Jessica stepping back, her wedding dress rustling, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Shock, confusion, anger, realization. "You borrowed money from Daniel to pay for our wedding." "I didn't have a choice. My credit cards are maxed out, the business accounts are frozen because we missed loan payments, and the hotel was going to cancel. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to tell me the truth." Jessica's voice cracked. "You've been lying to me about the business, about your finances, about everything. How bad is it really?" Trevor's silence was answer enough, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat tone of someone who'd accepted defeat. "Blackwood Consulting will probably be bankrupt within a month. I've got maybe 2 weeks before I have to lay everyone off. My personal credit is destroyed. The loans I guaranteed mean they'll come after my personal assets, my car, my condo, everything. And Daniel owns it all because he knew exactly which buttons to push to make everything collapse at once." The video showed Jessica swaying slightly, one hand reaching for the wall to steady herself. Her carefully applied makeup was starting to run as tears formed, but her next words weren't what Daniel expected. "This is all your fault," she said quietly. "You promised me a life. You promised me stability and success, and everything I deserved. You looked down on Daniel, called him a failure, made me believe I was trading up. But you're worse than him. At least he was honest about what he had. You're just a fraud in an expensive suit." "Jessica, please." "Don't touch me." She pulled away from Trevor's reaching hand. "I need to think. I need to figure out what this means. Just give me space." The video ended as Jessica walked away, leaving Trevor alone on the terrace with his head in his hands. Marcus's follow-up text arrived moments later. She found out about Daniel. Hotel management just told her he paid their debt. She's asking for his number. What do you want me to tell her? Daniel stared at his phone, his heart racing despite his efforts to remain detached. This was the moment he'd been orchestrating for weeks, but now that it had arrived, he felt none of the satisfaction he'd anticipated. Instead, there was only a hollow awareness that he'd succeeded in destroying Trevor's life and possibly Jessica's happiness. But what had he actually gained? "Don't give her my number," Daniel finally texted back. "She made her choice. Let her live with it." But 20 minutes later, his phone rang with Jessica's number. She'd kept it, apparently, or memorized it. Daniel stared at the screen through 3 rings before answering. "Daniel," her voice was thick with tears but controlled. "Is it true? Do you own Crown Point Tower?" "Yes." "And you've been deliberately destroying Trevor's business?" "I've been charging market rate rent for a commercial office space. If his business model couldn't survive that basic reality, the problems were always there. I just exposed them." "That's not an answer. You did this on purpose. You waited until right before our wedding to maximum the damage. This was revenge." Daniel felt his own anger rising to match hers. "You want to talk about revenge, Jessica? Let's talk about how you threw me out of our apartment without warning because someone wealthier showed up. Let's talk about how you called me pathetic and told me I'd never amount to anything. Let's talk about how Trevor offered me a pity job at his company while fucking my wife. Was that revenge, or was that just you showing your true character?" The silence stretched between them. But when Jessica spoke again, her voice had shifted to something desperate and pleading. "Daniel, please. I know I hurt you. I know I was cruel, but we were married for 6 years. That has to count for something. Trevor's business failing will ruin both of us. If you have any compassion left, any memory of what we had together, please help us." "Help you?" Daniel's laugh was bitter. "You want me to subsidize Trevor's failed business model so you can pretend everything's fine? You want me to enable the same arrogance and poor planning that got him into this situation? Why would I do that?" "Because you're not cruel. Because the Daniel I married wouldn't destroy people's lives out of spite. Because somewhere under all this anger, you're still the good man I fell in love with." Daniel closed his eyes, but the words stung more than he wanted to admit. Was he cruel? Had he become the villain in the story? He'd told himself this was justice, karma, consequences for other people's actions. But Jessica's tears and Trevor's collapse forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. He'd orchestrated suffering deliberately and methodically, and there was no moral high ground in that. "The Daniel you fell in love with died in that hallway when you threw his clothes out," Daniel said quietly. "You created this situation, Jessica, not me. You chose money over character, appearance over substance, and now you're married to a man whose entire life was built on debt and borrowed time. I didn't create Trevor's problems. I just stopped subsidizing his solutions." "So that's it? You're going to let everything burn out of pride?" "No, out of business sense. Crown Point Tower is my property, and I'm managing it according to standard commercial real estate practices. If Trevor can't adapt, that's unfortunate, but not my responsibility. You'll both need to figure out your next steps without my involvement." "I hate you," Jessica whispered. "I hate what you've become." "The feeling is mutual," Daniel replied and ended the call, but the conversation left him shaken in ways he hadn't anticipated. The certainty that had driven him for weeks suddenly felt less solid, replaced by questions he'd been avoiding. Had he gone too far? Was this really justice or just elaborate cruelty? And what did it say about him that he'd spent weeks planning the destruction of another person's life? The answers didn't come that night, or in the days that followed. But what did come was the inevitable unraveling of everything Trevor had built. Within a week, Blackwood Consulting officially filed for bankruptcy, unable to meet payroll or loan obligations. Trevor's personal assets were seized to cover guaranteed debts, including his luxury car and condo. The business community's gossip mill shifted from speculation to confirmed failure, ensuring that Trevor's professional reputation was permanently damaged. But Jessica's situation proved more complex. She moved back into her old studio apartment, the one Daniel had paid rent on for years, because Trevor's condo was taken by creditors. She returned to her previous job, having quit 6 months earlier to focus on wedding planning when Trevor promised to support her financially. Her social media, once filled with wedding joy, went silent entirely. Daniel learned these details through Marcus, who remained connected to their old social circle, but he felt none of the triumph he'd expected. Instead, there was only a profound emptiness, as if he'd expended all his energy on revenge and now had nothing left to fill the void. Crown Point Tower continued operating successfully under his ownership, but Daniel found himself increasingly disconnected from the accomplishment. He'd proven he could be a ruthless businessman, but at what cost? He'd destroyed Trevor comprehensively, but the victory tasted like ashes. 3 months after the wedding, Daniel received an unexpected letter. The handwriting was Jessica's, but the content was startling in its honesty. "Daniel, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not writing to ask for money or help. I'm writing because I need to acknowledge some truths I've been avoiding. You were right about Trevor, not just about his business problems, but about his character. In the months since the wedding, I've seen who he really is when the money and success disappear. He's bitter, resentful, and blames everyone but himself for what happened. He particularly blames me for marrying him at the worst possible time, as if I somehow caused his business to fail. But you were also right about me. I was cruel to you. I dismissed 6 years of marriage because someone wealthier appeared, and I told myself it was about ambition and wanting more from life. The truth was simpler and uglier. I was shallow. I valued appearance over substance, and I paid for that mistake. I don't know what you'll do with this letter. Maybe you'll feel vindicated. Maybe you won't care at all. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I threw away. You weren't a failure. You were someone building something real through honest work. I couldn't see that because I was too focused on what you didn't have instead of who you were. I'm not asking for reconciliation. That ship sailed and I burned it myself. But I am apologizing sincerely and without expectation of forgiveness. You deserved better than how I treated you. I hope you find happiness, Daniel. Real happiness, not the hollow victory of revenge. Jessica. Daniel read the letter 3 times, but his emotions remained complicated and unresolved. The apology was genuine, but it didn't undo the pain. The admission of her mistakes was honest, but it didn't justify his response. They'd both failed each other in different ways, and the aftermath had left everyone diminished. But the letter did spark one important realization. Revenge had consumed him completely for months, but it had solved nothing. Trevor was ruined, but Daniel wasn't happier. Jessica was struggling, but Daniel felt no satisfaction. He'd won every battle and somehow lost something essential in the process. The final twist came 6 months after the wedding, when Daniel learned through Marcus that Trevor and Jessica had divorced quietly and without drama. They'd lasted less than a year as a married couple, but the relationship had been effectively over the night of the reception. Trevor had moved to another city to escape his reputation, taking a middle management job that paid a fraction of what he'd once earned. Jessica had started therapy and was reportedly working on herself. As for Daniel, he continued managing Crown Point Tower successfully, but he also began using the property's income to fund small business loans for entrepreneurs who reminded him of himself, people with more ambition than capital, more character than connections. It didn't undo what he'd done to Trevor, but it represented a different path forward, one focused on building rather than destroying. The apartment where Jessica had thrown him out was eventually rented to a young couple, and Daniel sometimes wondered if they knew the history of that hallway. He never returned to see it himself, choosing instead to invest in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood where nobody knew his story. The Skyscraper downtown still bore his name as owner, but Daniel rarely thought about it as his greatest achievement. Instead, he thought about it as the catalyst that had revealed who he truly was, not just to Jessica and Trevor, but to himself. The revelation wasn't entirely flattering, but it was honest, and honesty seemed like the only foundation worth building on after everything that had happened. Years later, when people asked Daniel about his success in real estate, he never mentioned the revenge or the wedding or the deliberate destruction of Trevor Blackwood's life. Instead, he talked about luck, timing, and the importance of making ethical business decisions. It was true in its own way, even if it left out the messy parts, the parts where he'd been cruel, calculating, and consumed by anger. But late at night, alone in his house, Daniel sometimes wondered what would have happened if he'd chosen differently, if he'd revealed the inheritance to Jessica immediately, if he'd helped Trevor rather than destroyed him, if he'd taken the moral high ground instead of descending into elaborate revenge. The answers to those questions would never come, but the wondering remained. And perhaps that uncertainty, that permanent questioning of his own choices, was its own form of punishment, more lasting than anything he'd inflicted on Trevor or Jessica, because in the end, Daniel had inherited $100 million building, but lost something more valuable in the process: the certainty that he was a good person, and no amount of commercial success could buy that back. 5 years had passed since the wedding, but Daniel Morgan still measured his life in two distinct eras: before Crown Point Tower and after. The dividing line wasn't just about wealth or status, it was about the person he'd become when given the power to destroy someone who'd wronged him. The Tuesday morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office on the 58th floor of Crown Point Tower, but Daniel barely noticed the view anymore. The city skyline that once symbolized his triumph now just represented responsibility: hundreds of tenants, thousands of employees working in the building, millions of dollars in revenue that funded everything from property maintenance to the small business loan program he'd established. But today's calendar held an appointment that had been haunting him for weeks: a meeting with Adrian Foster, the new owner of Blackwood Consulting's assets, such as they were. When Trevor's company had gone bankrupt 5 years earlier, the intellectual property and client list had been purchased at auction by a competitor. Adrian had spent the past half-decade rebuilding what Trevor had destroyed, and now he wanted to discuss returning to Crown Point Tower. Daniel's assistant, Maria, a competent woman in her 40s who'd been with him for 3 years and knew better than to ask about his past, knocked softly on the doorframe. "Mr. Foster is here for your 10 o'clock, she announced. "Send him in," Daniel replied, straightening papers that didn't need straightening, a nervous habit he'd never quite shaken. Adrian Foster entered with the confident stride of someone who'd earned his success through grinding effort rather than inheritance or luck. He was younger than Daniel expected, perhaps 35, with the lean build of a marathon runner and eyes that assessed everything with sharp intelligence. They shook hands, and Adrian settled into the leather chair across from Daniel's desk with easy familiarity. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Morgan," Adrian began. "I know the history between this building and the original Blackwood Consulting is complicated, but I want to be direct. I've built what I believe is a genuinely strong consulting firm, and Crown Point Tower represents the perfect location for our expansion. I'm hoping we can discuss lease terms without the baggage of the past." Daniel appreciated the straightforward approach, but he also felt the familiar tension that came whenever Trevor Blackwood's name entered a conversation, even indirectly. "I respect that, Mr. Foster. Can you tell me about how you came to acquire Blackwood's assets?" Adrian leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I'd been watching Trevor Blackwood's operation for years, actually. I worked at a competing firm, and we all knew his business model was unsustainable. Too much overhead, too little focus on actual client results, too much ego-driving decisions. When the bankruptcy happened, I saw an opportunity to salvage the good parts: some talented staff members who'd been poorly managed, a client list that still had value if approached correctly, and a brand name that could be rehabilitated." "And have you rehabilitated it?" "I think so, yes, but I'm not interested in repeating Trevor's mistakes. My company operates lean, focuses on measurable client outcomes, and I don't personally guarantee loans I can't afford to repay." Adrian smiled slightly. "I also don't plan my wedding before securing my financial foundation." The comment hung in the air, and Daniel realized Adrian knew exactly what had happened 5 years ago. Of course he did. The story had become something of a legend in the city's business community, though the details were often distorted through retellings. Some versions painted Daniel as a ruthless mogul who'd destroyed a competitor for sport. Others portrayed him as a wronged husband exacting justified revenge. Neither version felt entirely accurate to Daniel, but both contained uncomfortable truths. "You've done your research," Daniel said carefully. "I have, but not to judge. I'm interested in the reality, not the legend. From what I've gathered, Trevor Blackwood was operating on borrowed time long before you inherited this building. You didn't create his problems, you just stopped subsidizing his solutions. That's business, not personal vendetta, regardless of what happened with your ex-wife. Daniel felt something unexpected, relief that someone understood the distinction he'd been trying to articulate to himself for years. But the relief was quickly followed by doubt, because the line between business and vendetta had been blurrier than Adrian's generous interpretation suggested. The truth is somewhere in between, Daniel admitted. I made business decisions that were technically justified, but the timing and execution were absolutely designed to maximize Trevor's suffering. I'd like to claim pure professionalism, but that would be dishonest. Adrian considered this for a moment before responding. Fair enough. But here's what matters to me. In the 5 years since then, how have you operated this building? I've talked to a dozen tenants, read reviews, studied your rental history and management practices. Everything suggests you're a fair, professional landlord who charges market rates, maintains the property excellently, and doesn't play favorites or pursue vendettas. Whatever happened with Trevor Blackwood, it seems to have been an isolated incident driven by specific circumstances. That's kind of you to say, but it doesn't erase what I did. No, it doesn't, but it suggests you learned from it, which is more than most people manage. Adrian pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be a business plan. So here's my proposal. I'd like to lease floors 41 and 42, ironically, the same space Trevor once occupied. I can afford market rate, I have excellent credit, and I'm looking for a 5-year lease with options to expand. I'm betting that you're no longer the person who used this building as a weapon, and I'm hoping you'll bet on me being someone who won't repeat Trevor's mistakes. Daniel took the folder, but his mind was already drifting to the question Adrian's proposal raised. Had he actually learned from what happened with Trevor, or had he simply redirected his energy into appearing virtuous while the guilt festered beneath the surface? Can I ask you something personal, Mr. Foster? Of course. Do you think revenge is ever justified? Not legally justified, morally justified? Adrian's expression grew more serious, and he took his time formulating a response. I think revenge is human. When we're hurt, especially by people we trusted, the desire to hurt them back is natural. But I also think revenge rarely gives us what we actually want. We think it'll bring closure or satisfaction or vindication, but usually it just creates new problems and new guilt. The people who hurt us move on with their lives, but we're stuck carrying the weight of what we did in response. The words struck Daniel with unexpected force because they articulated something he'd been feeling but couldn't quite express. He'd carried the weight of Trevor's destruction for 5 years, and despite all his philanthropic efforts and professional success, the weight hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown heavier as the initial anger faded and left only the consequences. That's a remarkably wise perspective, Daniel said quietly. Not really. I learned it from watching my father destroy himself, trying to get revenge on a business partner who'd cheated him. My dad won the legal battle, bankrupted the partner, got everything he wanted, and then spent the rest of his life bitter and isolated because revenge had become his entire identity. He couldn't let it go, couldn't move forward, couldn't see that he'd won the battle but lost himself in the process. Daniel felt as though Adrian were describing him, or at least the person he was in danger of becoming. The parallel was uncomfortable, but illuminating. I'll review your proposal seriously, Daniel said, setting the folder aside. But I need to think about whether returning Blackwood Consulting to these floors is something I can handle psychologically. The name alone carries a lot of history. I understand completely, Adrian replied, standing to leave, but I'd encourage you to consider that approving this lease might actually be the closure you need. Not because you're helping me, but because you'd be demonstrating to yourself that you've moved past the revenge mentality. You'd be making a decision based on business merit rather than emotional history. After Adrian left, Daniel sat alone in his office for over an hour, staring at the business plan without really seeing it. The conversation had dislodged something in his mind, forcing him to confront questions he'd been avoiding through busyness and good works. Had he moved past the revenge mentality, or was he just performing a version of himself that seemed more acceptable while the anger still simmered underneath? The phone on his desk buzzed with an internal call from Maria. "Mr. Morgan, there's someone here without an appointment who says it's urgent. A Mr. Trevor Blackwood." Daniel's entire body tensed at the name. Trevor hadn't contacted him in 5 years. Not after the divorce, not after the bankruptcy, not even through lawyers settling the loan Daniel had extended for the wedding venue. The silence had been total and, Daniel had assumed, permanent. "Does he say what this is about?" Daniel asked, his voice more controlled than he felt. "No, sir, but he looks unwell. I can send him away if you prefer." Daniel's instinct was to refuse the meeting, to maintain the distance that had made the past 5 years manageable. But Adrian's words about closure echoed in his mind, and some part of him recognized that perhaps this confrontation was inevitable and necessary. "Give me 5 minutes, then send him in." The 5 minutes felt like 5 hours as Daniel prepared himself mentally for seeing the man whose destruction he'd orchestrated so meticulously. What did Trevor want? Forgiveness? Confrontation? Money? And more importantly, what did Daniel want from this meeting? When Trevor finally entered the office, Daniel barely recognized him. The man who'd once exuded smug confidence in expensive suits now wore clothes that were clean but clearly second-hand. He'd lost weight, too much weight, and his face carried lines that suggested stress, sleepless nights, and perhaps illness. But his eyes, when they met Daniel's, held something unexpected. Not anger or resentment, but a kind of weary acceptance. "Daniel," Trevor said, his voice rough, "thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would." "I'm not sure why I did," Daniel admitted. "What do you want, Trevor?" "To apologize, primarily, and to tell you something I should have said 5 years ago." Daniel gestured to the chair Adrian had vacated, and Trevor sat with the careful movements of someone whose body hurt more than it should for a man in his early 40s. The change was shocking, and despite everything, Daniel felt a flicker of concern. "Are you sick?" Daniel asked before he could stop himself. "Cancer. Stage 3 when they found it 2 years ago. Stage 4. Now. The treatment's been expensive." Trevor laughed bitterly. "Though I suppose that's poetic justice, right? The man who built his life on borrowed money can't afford to save his own life." The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. He'd imagined many possible futures for Trevor: professional rebuilding, quiet mediocrity, even continued resentment, but terminal illness hadn't been among them. The revenge narrative suddenly felt grotesque and petty in the face of actual mortality. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, and meant it. "Don't be. I'm not here for sympathy." Trevor leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest in a way Daniel had never seen from him. "I'm here because I've had a lot of time to think about my life, about the choices I made, about what happened between us. And I need you to understand something. You didn't destroy me, Daniel. I destroyed myself." "Trevor, please let me finish. I've been rehearsing this for months." Trevor took a shaky breath. "When Jessica and I got back together, I wasn't thinking about her or even really about love. I was thinking about winning. She'd moved on, married someone else, and that bothered me because I'm a narcissist who couldn't stand the idea that someone I'd discarded had found happiness without me. So I came back, flashed some money around, and reclaimed her like a trophy. Daniel wanted to interrupt, to say that he'd already understood Trevor's motivations years ago, but something in Trevor's manner suggested this confession was more for Trevor's benefit than Daniel's, and interrupting would be cruel. When you inherited Crown Point Tower and raised the rent, I told myself you were the villain, Trevor continued. I convinced Jessica of it too, but the truth is my business was already failing. I'd overspent on everything, the office space, the staff, the marketing, my personal lifestyle, because I needed everyone to think I was successful. The actual work, the actual client service, was secondary to the image. You didn't cause that. You just exposed it. The timing was deliberate, Daniel said quietly. I knew exactly what I was doing when I raised the rent right before your wedding. I wanted to maximize your suffering. That's not business, that's revenge. It was both, Trevor countered. You charged market rate, which was your right as a property owner. But yes, the timing was calculated. And you know what? I deserved it. Not because of the business stuff, but because of how I treated you personally. The condescension, the job offer like you were some charity case, the casual cruelty of taking your wife while acting like I was doing you a favor. All of that was indefensible. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotions he couldn't quite identify. This conversation was nothing like what he'd imagined if he and Trevor ever spoke again. There was no anger, no accusation, just two men examining the wreckage of their choices with the brutal honesty that comes when there's nothing left to lose. Why are you really here, Trevor? This can't just be about apologizing. Trevor smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it. Actually, it is, and to tell you something about Jessica, because I think you deserve to know. She's doing well, by the way. Got a promotion at her company, started dating someone who seems genuinely decent, even went back to school part-time for a master's degree. She's built a good life, but she carries a lot of guilt about what happened to both of us. She sent me a letter years ago, Daniel admitted, apologizing. I know, she agonized over that letter for weeks, but there's something she didn't tell you, something I only learned during our divorce proceedings. When she kicked you out of the apartment, when she chose me over you, she'd just found out she was pregnant. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment as Daniel processed the information. What? She was pregnant with your child, but she didn't tell you because she'd already decided to leave you for me. She miscarried 2 weeks after the wedding. The stress, the doctor said, but she carried that guilt along with everything else. That she'd thrown you out while carrying your baby, that she'd chosen money over the father of her child, that she'd lost the pregnancy possibly because of the chaos she'd created. Daniel couldn't speak. His mind reeled with the implications, with the alternate timeline where he might have been a father, where Jessica might have made different choices if she'd been honest about the pregnancy. The revelation recontextualized everything, adding layers of tragedy to an already painful story. Why tell me this now? Daniel finally managed. Because you both deserve to stop punishing yourselves, Trevor said simply. Jessica punishes herself by never quite letting herself be happy, always holding back because she thinks she doesn't deserve joy after what she did. And you punish yourself by trying to be the perfect philanthropist landlord, trying to balance the scales for what you did to me, but neither of you can move forward while carrying all that weight. And what about you? Daniel asked. How do you move forward? Trevor's laugh was genuine this time, if still tinged with darkness. I don't particularly. I've got maybe a year left, probably less. But that's actually liberating in a way. When you know the ending is coming, you stop worrying about the middle chapters. I made my peace with my failures, apologized to the people I hurt, and now I'm just trying to enjoy whatever time remains. Is there anything I can do? Medical bills, treatment options, anything? No, Trevor said firmly, and I mean that. This isn't a manipulation or a plea for help. I have what I need, and accepting money from you would undermine the entire point of this conversation. I'm not here for absolution or assistance. I'm here to tell you that the revenge is over, Daniel. You won. But the victory is hollow because we're all damaged, and continuing to carry the weight of what happened serves no purpose except to make us all more miserable. Daniel felt tears threatening for the first time in years, not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming complexity of human relationships and consequences. He'd wanted Trevor to suffer, had orchestrated that suffering meticulously, and now faced the reality that his victory had contributed to a cascade of pain that extended far beyond his original intentions. I don't know how to let it go, Daniel admitted. The guilt, the questions about who I became, whether I'm fundamentally a good person or someone capable of cruelty when given power. I don't know how to resolve any of that. You probably can't, Trevor said with unexpected gentleness. Not completely. What you did to me and what I did to you and what Jessica did to both of us, those actions revealed things about our characters we might prefer not to see. But revelation isn't the same as determination. You learned you're capable of ruthlessness under the right circumstances. That doesn't mean ruthlessness defines you. It means you're human and complicated and capable of both great kindness and calculated cruelty depending on the situation. That's not particularly comforting. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be honest. Trevor stood slowly, wincing slightly from pain he tried to hide. I should go. I've said what I came to say, but I'll leave you with one last thought. Adrian Foster approached me before meeting with you. He wanted my perspective on whether you'd be a good landlord for his company. I told him you would be, and I meant it. Not because I think you're a saint, but because I think you learned something from what happened between us. What did I learn? Daniel asked, genuinely curious about Trevor's assessment. That power without wisdom is destructive, but power with wisdom can build something meaningful. You inherited a building, but you've turned it into something more. A business, yes, but also a platform for helping other people succeed. That's not the action of someone stuck in revenge. That's the action of someone trying to atone and move forward. After Trevor left, Daniel sat in his office for the remainder of the day, canceling all his meetings and just thinking. The conversation had unlocked something in him. A recognition that the narrative he'd been constructing for the past 5 years, where he was either villain or victim, hero or monster, was too simplistic to capture reality. He called Jessica's number, one he'd kept in his phone but never dialed in 5 years, and she answered on the 3rd ring with obvious hesitation. Daniel, is everything okay? Trevor came to see me today, he said without preamble. He told me about the pregnancy, about the miscarriage. The silence on the other end was profound, broken only by Jessica's sharp intake of breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I didn't know how, and the longer I waited, the harder it became. And then it felt like too much time had passed to bring it up without making everything worse. I'm not calling to make you feel guilty, Daniel said, surprised by his own calmness. I'm calling because I think we both need to let go of what happened. Not forgive necessarily, not forget, but stop letting it define our entire lives. Trevor's dying, Jessica. He has maybe a year left, and he spent part of that time coming to my office to tell me that we all need to move forward. Trevor's dying? Jessica's shock was evident and genuine. Cancer, advanced. He didn't want you to know, I think, but I'm telling you anyway because I think you'd want to reach out to him. Not as his ex-wife, but as someone who shared a significant part of his life and might want to offer support. I will, thank you for telling me. Jessica paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a different quality, something like hope mixed with resignation. Daniel, can I ask you something? Do you think we'll ever be okay? Not together, obviously, but just okay as people who once mattered to each other. I think we might be, Daniel said slowly, testing the truth of the words as he spoke them. Not today, maybe not for a while yet, but eventually. I think we're both carrying too much weight from the past, and Trevor's right that we need to set it down. The revenge, the guilt, the what-ifs, all of it needs to be acknowledged and then released. How do we do that? I don't know exactly, but maybe we start by being honest about what happened and why, accepting responsibility for our parts in it, and then consciously choosing to move forward rather than staying trapped in resentment. They talked for another hour, covering territory they'd never explored during their marriage or in its aftermath. The slow erosion of their relationship before Trevor returned, Daniel's feeling of inadequacy as Jessica's ambitions outpaced his earnings, Jessica's fear that she'd never have the life she'd envisioned, the ways they'd both failed to communicate honestly about their needs and disappointments. It wasn't easy conversation, and there were moments of anger and hurt, but there was also something healing in the honesty. When they finally ended the call, Daniel felt exhausted but somehow lighter, as if a burden he'd been carrying unconsciously had been partially lifted. Over the following weeks, Daniel made several significant decisions. He approved Adrian Foster's lease application for floors 41 and 42, but he did so after careful review of the business plan and financial projections, not as an act of symbolic closure. The distinction mattered. He was making a sound business decision that happened to also represent personal growth, rather than sacrificing business sense for symbolism. He also established a medical fund for terminal patients who couldn't afford treatment, though he did so anonymously and didn't tell Trevor about it. The fund wasn't about Trevor specifically, but about recognizing that financial hardship during serious illness was a crisis he had the resources to address. Trevor's situation had simply made the need more visible. But perhaps most significantly, Daniel began therapy with a psychologist who specialized in moral injury and complicated trauma. The term moral injury had come up during his research into how people processed guilt after making ethically questionable decisions, and it resonated deeply. He'd been injured not by what others did to him, but by what he'd done in response. The deliberate cruelty dressed up as business necessity, the satisfaction he'd felt watching Trevor's life collapse, the person he'd become when given power. The therapy was difficult. Dr. Sarah Thornton, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and an unflinching approach to hard truths, didn't let Daniel hide behind justifications or rationalizations. You keep trying to categorize your actions as either completely justified or completely reprehensible, she observed during their fourth session. But human behavior rarely fits into those neat boxes. You can acknowledge that Jessica's treatment of you was hurtful and that you had legitimate business reasons for raising the rent, while also acknowledging that you orchestrated Trevor's destruction with deliberate malice. Both things are true simultaneously. But how do I live with that? Daniel asked. How do I accept that I'm someone capable of that level of calculated cruelty? By recognizing that capacity exists in most people under the right circumstances, but that identifying it in yourself gives you the opportunity to make different choices going forward. You're not defined by your worst moment any more than you're defined by your best moment. You're defined by the pattern of choices you make over time. The sessions continued weekly, gradually unpacking not just the Trevor situation, but Daniel's entire relationship with power, money, and self-worth. He began to recognize patterns from his childhood: a father who'd measured success purely financially, a mother who'd stayed in an unhappy marriage for economic security, a family culture that confused wealth with virtue and poverty with failure. Jessica's rejection had triggered those deep wounds, but the wounds had existed long before. She'd thrown his clothes into the hallway. 6 months after Trevor's visit, Daniel received word through mutual acquaintances that Trevor had entered hospice care. The end was approaching faster than expected, but Trevor had apparently made peace with it, spending his final weeks connecting with old friends and enjoying simple pleasures. Daniel visited once, bringing no expectations or agenda, just a desire to see Trevor one final time. They didn't discuss the past or rehash old conflicts. Instead, they talked about baseball, about books they'd recently read, about the strangeness of autumn weather that year. It was ordinary conversation between two people who shared a complicated history, and somehow that ordinariness felt more meaningful than any dramatic confrontation could have been. "Thank you for coming," Trevor said as Daniel prepared to leave. "And thank you for the medical fund, even though you thought you were being anonymous." Daniel felt his face flush. "How did you know?" "Because I know you, Daniel, or at least I know the person you're trying to become. The vengeful person who destroyed my business wouldn't have created that fund, but the person trying to atone and build something better would do exactly that." Trevor smiled weakly. "For what it's worth, I think you're going to be okay. Better than okay. You've got the self-awareness and resources to become someone truly valuable to the world. Not just wealthy, but genuinely good. That's rare." Trevor Blackwood died 3 weeks later, quietly and surrounded by the few friends who'd stuck with him through the bankruptcy and illness. Daniel attended the small funeral service, sitting in the back and leaving before anyone could approach him with questions. Jessica was there too, sitting with her new boyfriend, the genuinely decent person Trevor had mentioned. And when her eyes met Daniel's across the room, they exchanged nods that carried years of shared history and mutual understanding. The funeral marked another turning point for Daniel, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the finality of Trevor's death that made continued resentment feel absurd. Perhaps it was seeing Jessica moving forward with her life and realizing he needed to do the same. Or perhaps it was simply that witnessing someone's death provided perspective on the pettiness of old grievances. Whatever the reason, Daniel found himself slowly releasing the narrative that had defined him for 6 years. He wasn't the wronged husband or the avenging property owner or the guilty philanthropist trying to balance cosmic scales. He was just a man who'd been hurt, had hurt others in return, and was now trying to figure out how to live with both experiences. The small business loan program he'd established grew substantially over the following years. Daniel took an active role in mentoring the entrepreneurs he funded, sharing not just capital but hard-won wisdom about managing success, handling failure, and maintaining ethical standards when faced with difficult choices. Many of the business owners he helped had stories similar to his own, people who'd been overlooked, underestimated, or knocked down by circumstance, but who possessed genuine talent and determination. One entrepreneur in particular, a woman named Keisha Williams, who'd been homeless while building a revolutionary food delivery logistics system, reminded Daniel so much of his younger self that he became deeply invested in her success. When her business took off and she needed expanded office space, Daniel offered her a favorable lease at Crown Point Tower. Not below market rate, but with flexible terms that acknowledged the volatility of startup growth. "Why are you helping me?" Keisha asked during their lease signing meeting. "You don't know me, and you could lease this space to an established company for more security." "Because someone once told me that power without wisdom is destructive, but power with wisdom can build something meaningful," Daniel replied. "I'm still figuring out the wisdom part, but I know that using my resources to help people like you succeed is more satisfying than almost anything else I do. People like me? People who've been counted out. People who know what it's like to struggle. People who have something to prove not because they're insecure, but because the world needs what they're building. Keisha studied him for a moment before responding. You're talking about yourself as much as me, aren't you? Probably, Daniel admitted with a slight smile, but that doesn't make it less true. As Crown Point Tower's reputation grew under Daniel's ownership, he received numerous buyout offers from major real estate investment firms. The offers were substantial, some exceeding $200 million, and accepting one would have made him extraordinarily wealthy without the ongoing responsibilities of property management. But Daniel turned them all down, much to his financial advisor's frustration. The building wasn't just an asset to him, it was a platform for the work he'd come to see as his real purpose. Managing the property, curating the tenant mix, creating opportunities for emerging businesses, these activities gave his life meaning in ways that pure wealth accumulation never could. You're leaving potentially hundreds of millions of dollars on the table, his advisor pointed out during one quarterly review. At some point, you need to think about maximizing your financial position. I am maximizing my position, Daniel replied. Just not my financial position. I'm maximizing my impact, my purpose, my contribution. The building generates more than enough income for anything I could reasonably want. More money wouldn't make me happier, but the work I'm doing through the building absolutely does. The advisor looked skeptical, but eventually nodded. You're either the wisest investor I've ever met, or you're leaving a fortune on the table out of guilt. I can't tell which. Maybe both, Daniel said, and left it at that. 7 years after the wedding that ended his marriage and catalyzed his transformation, Daniel received an unexpected email from Jessica. They'd maintained minimal contact in the years since Trevor's death. Occasional brief messages on holidays, one awkward coffee meeting to finalize their divorce paperwork, the kind of distant cordiality that suggested respect without intimacy. But this email was different. Jessica was getting married again to the boyfriend Daniel had seen at Trevor's funeral, and she was inviting him to the wedding. Not as a gesture of reconciliation or closure, the email clarified, but simply as acknowledgement that their lives had intersected significantly and that she wanted to celebrate this new chapter with all the people who'd been part of her journey, including the difficult parts. Daniel stared at the invitation for a long time, uncertain how to respond. Attending felt potentially awkward and emotionally complicated. Not attending felt like he was still trapped in old resentments, unable to move forward genuinely. The therapy skills he'd developed over the years suggested that his discomfort was precisely why attending might be valuable. Growth happened at the edge of our comfort zones. He RSVP'd, yes, but with anxiety that persisted until the wedding day arrived. The ceremony was simple and intimate, held in a botanical garden rather than an expensive hotel, with fewer than 50 guests. Jessica looked genuinely happy in a way Daniel had never seen during their marriage, relaxed, confident, content rather than anxiously pursuing some vision of what her life should be. Her fiancé, Marcus Chen, different from Daniel's real estate broker friend, sharing only a common name, seemed steady and warm, the kind of person who'd built a good life through consistent effort rather than flashy gestures. Daniel sat toward the back, much as he had at Trevor's funeral, but this time Jessica saw him before the ceremony and approached with a smile that seemed genuine rather than obligatory. "Thank you for coming," she said, squeezing his hand briefly. "I know this might be weird, but it means a lot that you're here." "I'm happy for you," Daniel replied and realized he meant it. "You deserve this." "We both deserve happiness," Jessica corrected gently. "You deserve it too, Daniel. I hope you're finding it." "I'm working on it." The ceremony was lovely, filled with personal touches that reflected the couple's actual relationship rather than social expectations. When Marcus spoke his vows, he mentioned explicitly that he valued Jessica, not despite her past struggles and mistakes, but because those experiences had shaped her into someone with genuine depth and compassion. The acknowledgement of imperfection as valuable rather than shameful struck Daniel as profoundly mature. At the reception, Daniel found himself in conversation with various guests who didn't know his history with Jessica. He was introduced simply as an old friend, which was both inaccurate and somehow true. They were old friends, in a sense, people who'd known each other intimately, hurt each other deeply, and eventually found a way to coexist peacefully in the aftermath. But the most significant moment came late in the evening, when Jessica and Marcus approached Daniel together at his table. Marcus extended his hand, and his grip was firm but friendly. "Jessica told me about your history," Marcus said directly, "all of it, including the hard parts. I wanted to thank you for being here despite that history. It shows real character." Daniel wasn't sure how to respond to that assessment. Did it show character, or just that he'd become skilled at performing growth while still carrying unresolved baggage? But Jessica's expression suggested she understood his uncertainty and didn't judge it. "Daniel's been on his own journey," Jessica said, addressing Marcus but clearly speaking to Daniel as well. "We both have. The people we were when we were married, we're not those people anymore. We've both changed, hopefully grown, definitely learned hard lessons. That's worth acknowledging." "It is," Daniel agreed, "and I genuinely am happy for you both. This," he gestured at the simple, heartfelt celebration around them, "this is what love should look like. Honest, grounded, built on real mutual understanding rather than fantasy or transaction." After the wedding, driving home through the city's night-lit streets, Daniel found himself reflecting on the arc of the past 7 years. He'd started this journey consumed by anger and humiliation, had wielded his inherited power as a weapon, and had discovered that victory through revenge was hollow at best and corrosive at worst. But he'd also built something meaningful from the wreckage, not just a successful property management business, but a life with purpose and impact. The guilt remained, probably always would remain to some degree. He couldn't undo what he'd done to Trevor, couldn't reverse the suffering he'd deliberately inflicted, but he could acknowledge it honestly, learn from it genuinely, and make different choices going forward. That seemed like the only honest form of redemption available. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Thornton, his therapist. "How was the wedding? Proud of you for going." Daniel smiled and typed back, "Complicated but good. Realized I'm actually okay with complicated now." "That's growth," came the immediate response. "See you next week." 10 years after inheriting Crown Point Tower, Daniel stood in his office on the building's top floor and looked out at the city with a perspective he couldn't have imagined during those early days of anger and revenge. The skyscraper had become more than property or symbol. It had become a laboratory for figuring out how to wield power responsibly, how to build rather than destroy, how to turn inheritance into legacy. The business loan program had funded 127 companies over the decade, with a success rate that exceeded industry averages. 12 of those companies now had offices in Crown Point Tower, creating an ecosystem of entrepreneurs who supported and learned from each other. Keisha Williams, the formerly homeless founder Daniel had mentored, had sold her logistics company for $80 million and had become a mentor herself, passing forward the same kind of support Daniel had provided. But perhaps more importantly, Daniel had developed genuine friendships with some of the people he'd helped. Relationships built on mutual respect rather than transactional exchanges. He'd learned to accept help as well as give it, to be vulnerable about his own struggles, to admit when he didn't have answers. The man who'd inherited the building in a state of heartbreak and rage had been transformed by the experience of wielding power, not into a villain or a saint, but into someone more complex and self-aware. He understood now that he was capable of both great generosity and calculated cruelty, both wisdom and pettiness, both growth and stagnation. The key was making conscious choices about which capacities to cultivate. His phone rang with an unknown number, which he normally wouldn't answer, but something prompted him to pick up. Daniel Morgan, a young woman's voice, uncertain but determined, speaking. My name is Sarah Blackwood. I'm Trevor Blackwood's daughter from his first marriage. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to tell you something. Daniel's heart rate accelerated immediately. He'd known intellectually that Trevor had a daughter. It had come up briefly during the bankruptcy proceedings years ago, but he'd never thought about her as a real person affected by the events he'd set in motion. I'm listening, he said carefully. My dad and I were estranged for most of my childhood. He was a terrible father, absent, selfish, only interested when it benefited him somehow. But in the last year of his life, after you two had that conversation in your office, he reached out to me. He apologized for everything, took responsibility, tried to rebuild our relationship. We only had about 10 months together, but those months meant everything to me. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. I'm glad you had that time together. I'm calling because I found something in his papers after he died. A letter he'd written but never sent. It was addressed to you. I thought you should have it. What does it say? I'll email it to you if that's okay. But the basic message is that talking to you, being honest about his failures, somehow freed him to be honest with other people too, including me. He said you gave him permission to be authentic in his final year by being authentic yourself. I don't know what happened between you two. He never told me details, but whatever it was, it somehow led to me getting my father back before he died. So, thank you, I guess, even though I don't really understand what I'm thanking you for. After the call ended, Daniel sat in stunned silence waiting for the email. When it arrived, Trevor's letter was surprisingly brief but achingly honest. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means my daughter found it and decided you should see it. I wrote this about 6 months before I died, but I could never quite bring myself to send it. Maybe because saying these things to your face that day in your office felt like enough. Or maybe because I was still too proud to fully admit how much our conversation changed me. You were right to destroy my business, not legally right or morally right, but cosmically right in some way I can't quite articulate. I'd built my entire life on ego, appearances, and borrowed capital, both financial and social. Someone needed to knock that house of cards down before it caused even more damage, and you did it. Was it revenge? Absolutely. Was it also necessary? I think so. But here's what I really want you to know. That conversation in your office, where we both stopped pretending and just admitted the ugly truths about who we were and what we'd done. That conversation saved the last year of my life. You showed me it was possible to be honest about failure, to acknowledge harm caused, to apologize without expecting absolution. I'd never seen that modeled before, and I desperately needed it. Because of that conversation, I was able to reach out to my daughter, to my ex-wife, to former employees I'd mistreated, and actually apologize meaningfully. I was able to spend my final months building something real, not wealth or status, but actual human connections based on truth rather than performance. So, thank you for destroying me, and thank you for showing me how to be honest in the wreckage. I hope you found your way to peace, because you deserve it as much as I didn't. Trevor. Daniel read the letter 5 times, each reading uncovering new layers of meaning and emotion. The revenge narrative he'd carried for a decade was being rewritten in real time, not as pure villainy or justified retribution, but as something messier and more human, an act that had caused genuine harm but had also inadvertently created space for growth and transformation. He couldn't reconcile these contradictions neatly. The suffering he'd inflicted on Trevor was still real. The calculated cruelty of his timing was still morally questionable. But apparently, somehow, something valuable had emerged from the wreckage, too. Not because revenge was good, but because honest confrontation with consequences had forced both of them to examine their lives more deeply than they might have otherwise. Daniel saved the letter and Sarah Blackwood's email, knowing he'd return to them repeatedly in the coming years. But he also recognized that this letter, arriving a decade after the events that sparked it, represented something important: the understanding that our actions have consequences we can't fully predict or control, and that even our worst moments can sometimes catalyze growth in unexpected ways. That didn't justify what he'd done, didn't erase the guilt or make the revenge noble, but it complicated the narrative in ways that felt more honest than simple condemnation or self-flagellation ever could. As Daniel left his office that evening, riding the elevator down from the 58th floor, he thought about all the lives intersecting within Crown Point Tower, the entrepreneurs building dreams, the established companies maintaining operations, the maintenance staff keeping everything running, the security guards protecting it all. Each person had their own story, their own struggles, their own moments of both grace and cruelty. He'd inherited a building, but what he'd really inherited was responsibility for the decisions he made, for the power he wielded, for the person he chose to become with those resources. That responsibility was heavy, sometimes overwhelming, but it was also the thing that gave his life meaning beyond simple material comfort. The evening air was cool as Daniel walked home, taking the long route through the city that had become a kind of meditation. 10 years ago, he'd been consumed by rage and humiliation, planning revenge with meticulous detail. Tonight, he was just a man walking home after work, carrying complicated history but also genuine peace with the complexity. The inheritance had given him wealth, but the journey had given him something more valuable: self-knowledge. He knew now what he was capable of at his worst, which meant he could consciously choose better at his best. He knew the hollow satisfaction of revenge, which meant he could recognize when anger was driving decisions and make different choices. He knew the weight of moral injury, which meant he could be more thoughtful about wielding power. None of this made him a hero. It just made him human, flawed, growing, trying to do better while accepting that better was a direction rather than a destination. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that had to be enough. Because in the end, Daniel had learned that the most expensive thing he'd inherited wasn't the $100 million skyscraper. It was the responsibility to use that gift wisely, knowing he'd already proven himself capable of using it cruelly. Every day was a choice between those two paths, and every day he tried to choose wisdom over revenge, building over destroying, growth over stagnation. Some days he succeeded better than others, but he kept choosing, kept trying, kept growing, and slowly, year by year, the weight of victory became just slightly easier to carry.